And a lot of people always ask me, like, how did you continue in special education? Like, wasn't it so difficult to constantly be in the world of disability? But for me, being able to give back to parents and help them navigate the system was so rewarding for me that completely fed me. That completely uplifted me.
Joanne D. Simone is the author of Fall in Recovery. It's a beautiful book about how the wisdom of dance translated into the wisdom of life as she raised two children with disabilities. It's a story about strength, perseverance, and most of all, it's about parental love. As you listen to this conversation, ask yourself, what are the metaphors from your personal journey that you might apply to your life? Is there wisdom from sports, arts, nature, or perhaps child rearing that gave you invaluable, timeless wisdom about living your very best life here, now, today? This is a terrific conversation. Come join us. Joanne, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Thanks for having me, Pat. I'm so happy to be here. Sure. So my story begins with my son, Benjamin. When he was a week old, my husband and I took him to the pediatrician for his first checkup. And during the exam, the doctor put the measuring tape around Benjamin's head and said, his head size is a little small, but your head size is a little small. So maybe it's fine. When my husband and the doctor, left after the exam and went to the consultation room, I was dressing Benjamin and my entire body, could feel that this was not something that we were ever going to be able to brush aside. And yeah, by the time he was 2 months, we went back to the doctor and he said, yeah, maybe it's time to go for a baseline checkup with a neurologist, which we did, and it went fine. But then 2 months later, when Benjamin was 4 months old, we went back and then it was, oh, I think we should do some testing. And by the way, call to get early intervention services. And I was stunned by that and, sort of asked her, like, why call for services before we have any testing done? And she just said, well, it won't hurt. And when we left the office, my husband said, why did that bother you so much? And I was a special education teacher and I didn't have any real experience in early intervention, but I had taken a class and my brain was just telling me the earlier, the younger a child is when they're diagnosed, the more severe the disability is going to be.
Mm.
And sure enough, after the testing was done, we got this diagnosis or we got these results on an answering machine on a Friday afternoon and the doctor just said, yes, there were several abnormalities on the CAT scan including enlarged ventricles and pachygyria, and I didn't have any idea what any of that meant. And I called her back and said, you can't leave this message for us on a Friday afternoon and expect us to survive the weekend. Like, what does this mean? And she really had no answers, nothing. And for 2 weeks, my husband and I kept calling her and saying, what does it mean? And she'd say things like, when he's older, if you show Benjamin an apple and ask him what it is, will he be able to tell you? I don't know. And it just sounded like garble to us. So I got all of the test results and gave them to the pediatrician. And the results said that Benjamin had something that was a subcategory of lissencephaly. And the pediatrician had no idea what that was. And that's all I think was, how does he not know what it is? So he sent us to a new neurologist who did know what it was. And, basically at the first visit said to us, well, he has cerebral palsy. And I was like, how does he know a 5-month-old has cerebral palsy? And then he said, he'll probably never walk or talk or use his hands. But more importantly, I have no idea what his cognitive functioning will be. And any bottom that I had left fell. It was it. Like, there was nothing to climb back up from at that stage. So, we definitely, we were going through early intervention, and this was 1999, so I had no home computer, no internet service, right? I had no lifeline there, but we did ask a friend who had those things, and she found a support group, and their motto was like, touched briefly for all eternity. And I was like, oh, that's not
Oh,
comforting at all. So we bought a computer, got on the internet, joined this group. And yeah, the information never sort of got better. It was okay. The average lifespan is 2 years. There's a lot of medical challenges, seizures that can't be controlled, orthopedic issues and surgeries, immobility issues, feeding problems and feeding tubes, breathing problems and trachs. So it just snowballed. It just snowballed. And there was a time, where we weren't certain if he was going to live to see his first birthday because he did start having seizures at 7 months and we couldn't get them under control. It took a few medication trials. So, yeah, it was, we were just in survival mode. That's all we could do.
well,
But
emotional
fortunately, yeah.
it was emotional survival. Your story so resonates with me. I went through a cancer diagnosis, and
Mhm.
they left an. I was down in Napa, Sonoma for a wine event for 3 days, or maybe it was 4 days. Anyway, that Friday night, that Friday late afternoon, it was early evening. My oncologist left a message on my machine saying, "We've misdiagnosed your cancer. Call the office on Monday." I mean, I the your world drops out from underneath you. Like, what is going on? And, so I mention that only because, boy, I think doctors need to learn a little bit about communication here. They really don't understand emotionally what we all have on the line.
Yes, and I related to that as a special educator because I felt like the first time I sat at a table on the parents' side, I suddenly had that aha moment like, "Oh, I didn't get it. I didn't know the emotional weight that the families carried. I didn't get how much they had to deal with in the world. All of the agencies that you have to deal with, medical, educational, insurance, all this stuff, it it just causes so much conflict and it's not something you appreciate as a provider.
Well,
So I agree.
the whole thing's so overwhelming, and it just sends your life spiraling off on a tangent you never expected, financially, socially, emotionally. I mean, it's like the comprehensive, package of what has happened to me.
Yeah. And I just remember very early on having a real sense of, oh, where in the world is Benjamin going to fit in outside of our family bubble? And that's terrifying, to think that there's no sense of belonging for your child. So, yeah, I mean, we experienced that again later on when we had our second son. Sebastian was born when Ben was he was almost 4. And, you know, we had done a lot of research into, what caused lissencephaly and what are our risks of that happening again. And we were, you know, convinced, fairly well convinced that it wasn't going to happen again, that it wasn't genetic, but we were terrified anyway. But we went ahead and had a second child, and he seemed perfectly fine, and his development was right on target for the first year, and then we started to notice that his speech skills weren't quite developing, and there was a lot of up and down for me, in and out of denial and, not wanting to think that there was something else going on with another child. But my husband was, much more clear headed. And, you know, we sort of had a moment where he was like, take a look at this. Like, this isn't okay. And I had to just say, you know what? Okay, you're right. So I went directly into clinician mode and, confronted the doctors and, went through early intervention, all this testing. And, it turned out that he was on the autism spectrum. So, we sort of had two completely different children, with completely different needs. And on Benjamin's side, there was so much, that needed to happen on the medical front. So many challenges there. And with Sebastian, all the challenges ended up being in the education, placements. So it was tough right from the start. He was sort of the perfect fall in the crack kind of kid. He had a lot of good skills and then he had a lot of, you know, challenges. And when you have a child whose skills are so splintered like that, it makes it difficult to, find just the right place. And we struggled through preschool, we struggled through kindergarten, and then it really just hit its peak, um, where he was in a kindergarten classroom that wasn't working, and the school didn't want him,
Mm.
but they also sort of dragged the process along. So even though after much research, we found a school that we thought was really going to help him out, public school took so long that we lost his seat like a day before they agreed to send him. So again, we were in this situation where our kids have nowhere to belong. What are we going to do? And we had my husband and I both grew up in Brooklyn, and that's the only thing we ever knew, and we were faced with this decision of leaving and going to New Jersey, which was not something we necessarily, you know, were sure was the right thing, but ultimately being convinced that we were in, a community that was not accepting our children for who they were and they had no place to fit in, we made this move. And fortunately for us, it worked out. It worked out for the kids, and both of their school situations had, dramatically improved. And it stabilized our lives enough so that I had a moment to finally work through everything that we had been through. I got to take a look back at the process, the whole journey and the rest of my life and how it all sort of connected and move forward to find a way to deal with the conflict that still existed.
One of the things that, as you tell the story, that comes to my mind is how did you take care of yourself during those early years?
Yeah, the beauty of I mean, the standard things, right? I mean, one, when Ben was 2, we put him in a half day self-contained special education preschool, and I found parents there who were walking the walk, and there's nothing like finding your community and just walking into a room where people get what your life is, so you don't have to, apologize, you don't have to make excuses, it is what it is and everyone gets it. So I leaned on those folks a lot for sure. I was leaning on the online community in those early years also, and doing the things that everyone tells every parent they need to do, like make sure you go out once a week with your, spouse and have a date night. And, but I was also working. And the funny thing is I did take time off from teaching, but when Ben was 2, I went back. And a lot of people always ask me, like, how did you continue in special education? Like, wasn't that so difficult to constantly be in the world of disability? But for me, being able to give back to parents and help them navigate the system was so rewarding for me that completely fed me. That completely uplifted me.
Oh, I can so see that because as you said earlier, until you've sat on the other side of the table, you just don't get it. And getting it is it's a really difficult road. But as you say, I agree with you wholeheartedly, the ability to help other people navigate similar things, it it brings meaning, I think, to your own journey.
Definitely. Purpose,
Yeah.
it gives you a direction. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so part of that too, I had a friend who worked for the Board of Education, and she taught in college, she was teaching, students to be special educators. And she asked me to come in and speak to her class and give them the parent perspective. And after I did that, every time I did it, the students would come up and say, "You have to write a book." And I would say, "Sure, in my spare time, I'll write a book." But, at some point, I think when everything settled down with the kids, like I couldn't get that out of my head. And I thought, you know what? I think providers need to hear that parent perspective. They need to hear the things that parents aren't telling them. And so I started writing about the experience and taking writing workshop classes. And, I walked in with, a stack of pages and was reading. And the teacher said, "You know what? Your hook is dance." And I was like, "What?" Because I'd been a professional dancer and there were things about dance that I thought about and had written about, but not extensively. And so I scratched my head, but I was like, "Okay, I'll go with it." And I started to write more about dance. And then I started to realize that things that I learned as a dancer were not dance lessons, they were life lessons. And these were things that I could carry forward. And then I started to try to improve my writing and I started writing essays. And I wrote this essay for Brainchild magazine that was called Bury My Son Before I Die. And I talked about having a child who might die and doing everything I could to keep him alive, but being terrified also about what happens if I die first. And the response was so overwhelming, but I got one message from this mom who was in a similar situation, and she wrote, "For the first time, I don't feel like a monster for having all of these same thoughts." And I was broken hearing her say it. The idea that she was struggling the way I was struggling and was shaming herself for having these very normal you know, thoughts and reactions to a very difficult situation was sort of more than I could bear, but it gave my writing and my book a completely new focus. I knew there had been something missing, but I wasn't sure what it was, and I realized then that I have to focus on all the conflicts. I have to be brutally honest, and then it was like a light bulb went off. When I was dancing, I had a very important experience in college where I danced Jose Limon's There Is a Time, which is based on Ecclesiastes 3, to everything. There is a season. And, it talks, of course, about the extreme opposites in life, right? A time to be born, a time to die. And I was like, yeah, I'm dealing with these kinds of dichotomies all the time as a parent. And so I realized then that that would need to be the structure of the book, that I was going to talk about the dichotomies and how that related to the psalm and how I could use the dance lessons to manage those conflicts.
You talk about something really important for all of us, and that is finding a place where you fit in. And it is very hard. I think it's hard for everybody in a different way. Actually, I think it's harder for maybe creative people who are a little outside the mainstream. You wrote something in your book, and this hit me so hard. You wrote, "As I see it, society is fond of creating hierarchies and placing one type of intelligence at the top. We're conditioned from the start to celebrate good health, good grades, and good behavior. When we birth children who don't have these traits, we grieve because our culture always told us to, and we anticipate a societal outcasting." And that is what happens with it's not just with a child, it's with any illness or anything that doesn't make you fit into that perfect little mold. You are outcast.
Yeah. Yes. And it's not a fun place to be. It's not a fun place to
And
be.
yet
And it's the kind of thing that I didn't think about early on in the journey. I think I was too busy trying to survive, right? And, dealing with all of that. But getting to, years later, being able to look at it and say, like, "Oh, yeah, like society is telling me this is a bad thing." And, you're ingrained with that, but you still also have to find the joy in life, right? You have to live in this extreme. And I think it's difficult to come to that realization and break it all down part of my training as a dancer, um, Limon teaches you fall and recovery, which is why that's the title of my book. You use gravity in order to generate movement and in order to recover. And it's like a swing, you go down to go up.
Mhm.
And then there's, this suspension at the top, this very light and wonderful ease, right? And so all of this sort of taught me, I really believe that when you're having even difficult experiences that you have to allow yourself to live in them, right? Being in the moment is not exclusive to everything joyful. When things are difficult, you still have to live in it. You have to allow that gravity to take you, but you have to fall with the direct intention to rise.
And it's interesting. Well, it's very hard being outcast at any point in your life. I would argue that if you can dig deep within yourself during that experience, you're setting yourself up for a much deeper, richer, and more meaningful life. Because the people who fit into the perfect box with the perfect life, they're the ones that blow up at 40 years old.
You're right. I don't think there is no perfect,
No,
really. I
there
just,
isn't.
and I'm just convinced, it's like I remember seeing a picture online where it's like this is how life really is, right? There's a picture of an apple and it's all shiny on the side you see it, but on the other side it's rotten, right? Like we live in a world where all we see is the shiny. and
Yeah.
and that's how very much I felt as a parent, especially when the kids were younger. Always loved memoir, and I would go to the store and I would try and find books, about the parent experience. And I just started turning to the final page, and if it was like, and we all lived happily ever after, I would just put the book back on the shelf because I was like, I can't relate to that story. Where are the people who are really struggling? And so I felt strongly that I needed to write with that kind of truth,
Well,
because otherwise, yeah, you just isolate yourself. And we do that anyway in the world of disability, in the world of parenting, right? All mothers, I think, have been judged forever. We are always, the finger is always wagged at us. Everything is our fault. And then, there's a lot of blame and shame. And, I sort of decided I was going to step up on a hill and say to parents, nah, no, like, stop shaming yourselves. Like, it's okay. Validate your feelings, because once you do that, then you can just appreciate getting through the rest of the journey.
and it's not, it's everywhere in our society. We have all these standards that are set that are absolutely impossible. Perfectionism is just a terrible thing. I mean, it prevents you from just enjoying the downright good that comes your way.
Absolutely. It does. It's the thief, right? I think I've heard people say that. It is a thief. Like, always hoping for something, different and beyond, it steals your joy, and that it can't be the goal. It can't be the goal.
No, I think the part of the goal has to be, as you were saying earlier, be present to whatever it is and experience it. Because, you know, as humans tend to be dualistic people, hot, cold, light, dark, we look at extremes. And I have come to believe that the more extreme our experiences, the deeper our appreciation is of the other extreme. So that
Mhm.
when we've really known hardship, we really know joy.
Oh, sure. That pendulum swings. My experience, so I talk in the book about how my father died unexpectedly on the morning of my brother's wedding day. And I sort of had this moment where I realized that when I was sitting in church that day as a 9-year old, listening to my brother recite his vows, and at the same time listening to my mother crying, that those two things existed simultaneously. And that, to me, is how life is, really. The extremes coexist. And it was something that I also saw in the dance that I had done. We had gone through this entire dance where we, played out all the dichotomies that is in life and in the psalm, and you come to the end and you're standing in a circle together, sort of rejoicing in the gratitude of having gone through all of it, and it all existed together. And I realized that that's exactly what I had as a parent. that in my children there was both joy and grief at the same time. And that was normal and that was okay to experience. I didn't have to choose one or the other, that I could live in both and that could balance you.
If you could rewrite your story, would you?
I don't like to play in those hypotheticals. I'll be honest.
Yeah,
I don't,
fair
I
enough.
don't. I don't think that allowing your brain to go somewhere that just can't exist isn't healthy for me to do. So it's not in my power to do that. It is only in my power to take what I've experienced and make it better moving forward for myself and for my family and hopefully for others.
How old are your kids now and how are they?
Yeah, Benjamin's 25 and Sebastian is 22 and yeah, they're their beautiful selves. I mean, Benjamin is still living at home with us full time and he's relatively healthy and stable and happy. And that's the most important thing to me is his quality of life, which I feel like we've been able to achieve. And Sebastian is actually currently in school out of state in an inclusive college program. And he's also a collegiate athlete, which was a tremendous hurdle to overcome because we knew that he wasn't going to necessarily be a degree seeker in a college program. And he was a varsity athlete in high school, and he very much wanted to continue running cross country and track. But all the colleges we talked to kept saying, "Oh, no, 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 he can't run because he's not earning a degree, and the NCAA rules won't allow for that." And as a special education parent advocate, I don't take no as a final answer until I fully educated myself. So I allowed, those naysayers to think what they needed to think. But I did the research and I hired a consultant who specialized in eligibility. And we did find a school who was willing to partner with us to get a waiver for Sebastian. And, it took some doing and a lot of research and a lot of feeding the school what they needed in order to get everyone on board. But yeah, they ended up contacting the NCAA and after more paperwork, they were like, "Yeah, we'll give him this waiver." And then they said, "You know what? Anyone in your college, in this program can compete without applying for the waiver." And then they said, "You know what? We're just going to change the legislative language. Anyone in the country in a Division 3 school who is able to participate in sports is allowed to do so." And it was just, it was the height of, advocacy for sure for us. So very
Well,
happy to have been a part of that.
that's amazing. Your ability to keep moving things forward is just amazing. If you could give some words of wisdom to people, what would you tell them?
Mm. I think, yeah, we've talked about like just finding your community so that you're not isolating yourself. I think that's so, so, so important. I think that it's really important to validate your feelings and allow yourself to go through the journey. Allow yourself the space and the grace to go through the journey without blaming yourself in the process. So I just think that finding a way to look at things in your life also that may seem completely disconnected and finding that connection will give you all of the tools that you need to move forward.
I'm going to take this conversation a little bit off on a tangent. I may end the podcast with what you just said, okay? But
Okay.
I also have a subscriber only section. And I
Okay.
wanted to talk to you a little bit. I really, really liked the way you integrated the wisdom that you learned from dance into your book. And I think that whether it's an art or a sport, there are so many life lessons to be learned that we can pull into the rest of our lives. W- you talked a little bit about how that came to be in your book, but how did you get that organized? Was it a moment of inspiration? how did you integrate that into the story? How did you come to integrate that into the story?
Yeah, so, when that first teacher had told me to focus more on dance, I literally, like, went back into the book, and anywhere I mentioned anything related to dance, I took out, and I just started to write more about it. And then I was very inspired also, there's a book called The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch.
Yes, yeah,
Love that book.
I've seen his talk.
Yes, yes. And he talked about the lessons he learned as a child from his football coach. And so it started to like form this puzzle, in my brain. And then I took another writing class that had to do with revising. And that was really where I started to put it all together. I had this idea of using, there is a time as the structure, but then I had to figure out how to make it work, of course. But I absolutely just wrote out the psalm. I came up with dichotomies of parenting and matched those things,
Mhm,
and then took a look at the dance things that I wrote and applied them. And I wanted to show also a journey throughout the book because clearly at the start, I wasn't using these lessons. And so in the beginning of the book, I kept the lessons completely separate. And I did that because they were sort of just a distant whisper, but not something I thought applied. So then in the middle section, I integrated the lessons, but the way I see it, I wasn't using them effectively. I was actually countering what the lessons were telling me because I still didn't necessarily think that they applied on that deeper level. And then in the last section, I showed how I very consciously decide to use those lessons when something happens, right? So if I'm trying to figure out, okay, Ben needs a feeding tube and it's not something I want him to have. And how is that going to affect me? And what am I going to have to do for him physically and deal with insurance and all of the, companies, the supply companies and all of that. And then I think about my experience as a dancer, where on stage, my number one job is to relay the message that the choreographer's given me. That's my
mhm,
task. I am supposed to disappear in that process. It is not about how high my leg is and how good a dancer I am. It is just about me being this vessel of a message. And when I think about that in relation to making these kind of decisions with Ben, I say, like, I have to remove myself from this equation. I don't matter in this picture for this specific decision. So take myself out of the equation and just focus on what Benjamin needs in this moment. And then it's so much easier to say, like, oh, okay, he needs the feeding tube. So it was all a process, right? Writing the book was a process and a journey. And one, figuring out, like, I feel in art, when you're doing something, you work on it long enough, it figures out what it's supposed to be. That's how I felt dance was, right? You take a step, you make a phrase, you create a longer dance, and then eventually it reveals itself to you. And I felt like that's what the book did. And it helped reveal that, oh, wow, this all applies. And the beauty of it was, for me, leaving dance was, I knew it was something I had to do, but it was something that I also had some regret about because I had this one teacher who he was a wealth of wisdom. And I had sort of tasked myself with this idea that I was going to share all of his lessons as a dancer. And when I left dance, I felt guilty because I felt like I wasn't doing that and he had died. And I felt like I was just letting him die and remain that, just forgotten. And when I wrote the book and rediscovered the lessons and figured out how to reapply them, it relieved that guilt and regret. And, in the bigger picture, I was like, wow, when you can use all the things you left behind, you don't have to have any regret about the decisions you've made in the past. It's more than just, oh, it all led me to here. It was, I can actually actively use those things to better myself.